Great. Well, welcome to the webinar. It's really a very exciting opportunity for me to have some time to tell you about my experience, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk about this at the end. And I chose this for my title, which I'll explain in just a moment, because I really think that what we need to do as tropical biologists of whatever sort is we need to become engaged in activities outside of academia to really have an impact. And that means that you have to put yourself in rooms and at tables with people who are different from who we have been associating with for many years. And I'm going to talk today about my experiences in doing this over the past few years within the context of my work with forest restoration and conservation, both in and outside of academia. Okay, so that quote, this quote, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu, probably comes from someone else, but Elizabeth Warren is attributed to this quote. And if you don't know already, Elizabeth Warren is one of our many Democratic candidates for president in the USA, a very outspoken member of the US Senate. And she knows this from experience as well, that if your voice is not heard in the larger dialogues that are going on, if you're not there in the room, if you're not participating in the discussion, no one is going to speak for you. And your point of view and your perspective and your experience is not going to be reflected in the discussions and the policies and the practices that come out of those meetings. So that's why it's important that you work to get a seat at that table. And most of us, perhaps not all of the people listening, but many of us come from an academic environment. In English, we call this, this has been called the ivory tower. This cartoon depicts a tower of books, but it's the same idea that scientists and academics, researchers tend to be isolated within universities or research facilities, away from the problems of the world, and with that distance, they are able to study the world, right? But in fact, the tradition has been for the real action that needs to be done in the world is done by other people. That the people in the ivory tower, the people in the research community are just there to do the research and to study it. And this has led to lots of debates about the role of activism and taking on particular points of view within our fields. And I think everyone has to find their own balance. But there is always a tension between doing the research as an outsider or with an objective perspective, and then being an advocate for particular policies. So that's going to be a big theme that I will be discussing during the webinar. And I think as I've thought about this in terms of forest restoration, but it also applies to almost any kind of conservation or management activity, there are three sides to it. There's the theory, which are the research, the concepts, the scientific understanding, and all of the people associated with generating that activity. There's the policy. The policy is concerned with targets and governance and finance and incentives and how to actually make things happen. And then there's the practice of the actual engagement, planning, and implementation of restoration in this case, on the ground. So practice is very much focused on the ground. Now, within each of these corners, there are people involved. So in the theory arena, you have social and natural scientists. They're conducting research. They're looking at things like, what are the opportunities for restoration? What are different approaches to restoring forests? What are the biophysical and social outcomes of different interventions? These researchers predominantly work within an academic institution, but they can also be researchers associated with a government agency or a non-governmental organization. In the policy arena, These people are the decision makers who work at different levels of government, and they're determining things like the restoration targets, the objectives for restoration. They are seeking and allocating funding or other sources of support for forest restoration. And they're making policies and regulations about how to incentivize and promote forest restoration in different regions. In some cases, the decision makers can also be the leaders of local communities that are influencing land use decisions and regulating activities. And then the practitioners, who are the ones doing the work on the ground, they're the ones that are engaging the stakeholders, they're planning the restoration interventions, they're implementing them, and they're monitoring them. They can be working within a government agency or a non-governmental organization, and they also may be working closely with the private sector to raise funds and develop supply chains, such as the seeds and seedlings or technical expertise, and also the value chains, the products that come out of restoration for local or commercial use. The practitioners can also include community-based groups that are implementing forest restoration and monitoring. And then in the middle is the actual process of forest restoration itself, which is involving all sectors of civil society as well as the environment itself, locally, regionally, and globally. And this kind of triangle, I think, could apply to all kinds of different activities, not just forest restoration. What I want to emphasize now is these arrows that are connecting these corners. And it's those arrows where those critical links where scientific research can really have a role to play. So for example, the theory corner is linked to policy in terms of providing information for science-based policy and also for policy-oriented science. This arrow goes both ways. Scientists learn about problems in the world that are generated from the policy side that they need to address with their research. And also policy has interest in understanding what policies work best under different conditions, what outcomes they have, and all of that information coming from scientific research. Theory and science also has a connection with practice in the left side. Those links also go two ways. So the theory can help to inform practice, what kinds of practices produce different outcomes, and what are techniques that are involved and that have particular relevance. And practice can also inform theory. That is, practitioners can also provide a lot of information that we can use to understand how things work in a scientific context. So these are two important ways in which scientific research can have a really important role. But keeping in mind that there's still a very distinct role of the scientist here. This doesn't mean the scientist has to become a practitioner or that the scientist becomes a policymaker. Rather, they engage in exchange of information both ways to create these valuable links. And scientists and policymakers in particular, I'm just pulling out those two groups, have very different ways of doing their jobs. And that's why it's important that we each do our job well. So scientists, the way they go about doing their research requires attention to precision and making fine distinctions. On the other hand, a policymaker, really, precision is the enemy of the policymaker. They want to keep things very vague, very open, use terms that are very inclusive. The scientist's job is to break down myths and to provide robust statistical analysis to disprove a hypothesis. That's what we've all learned, right? The job of the policymaker is to look selectively for evidence that things can happen and to do storytelling. And they look specifically for positive cases and positive results. And if they have one case that really shows that something works, they're happy. They close the book. They don't want to know more. They can go with that. Scientists are looking for the truth. They're looking for validating certain hypotheses, and often that's a crooked path. They follow different hypotheses, and finally they come to finding more truth about how things work. Policymakers, on the other hand, they follow a path of least resistance. If something doesn't work, they try something else, and they basically try to appeal to different communities with different arguments, and they go with what works, rather than having to set out a specific thing that they want to prove. And then also, scientists strive to understand where the gaps are in our knowledge and where we need to do further research. Whereas policymakers are really looking for the gaps in know-how and how to get things done and experience in terms of executing particular policies. On the other hand, there's intersection points. And this is where I think we can often have dialogues between scientists and policymakers. For example, consensus building about really what is the evidence and why is that evidence important for making policy. Generalizations. Policymakers like generalizations. Scientists also like generalizations. So together we can come up with what are some good generalizations we're satisfied with on both sides. And also the broad social relevance. Everyone likes to be engaged in activity that to them has a broad social relevance, and that applies equally well to scientists and policymakers. If you want to read a little bit more about this, I wrote a paper with a colleague, and we each took on the role. I took on the role of scientist, and my colleague Lars took on the role of policymaker. You can read about that. But I think too, when we break out of an academic setting, it's important to have some role models. Some of us might have Jane Goodall as a role model. She's a hero for many, many people. Also, in my case, David Lamb, pictured here right next to me in the front with the blue hat. He has been a role model of mine for many years. His work has become very important for a lot of the international NGOs working with restoration, and also with government and regional agencies. And he knows how to package information in ways that these agencies can use. And that's a skill that I think is really important to begin to have an impact outside of academia. Another role model for me is Jeff Sayer, pictured here in one of the conferences that we recently had. And Jeff has also worked in many capacities with World Wildlife Fund, with IUCN, with C4 as a director, initially their first director. And he knows how to talk with the forestry community, with the conservation community, with practitioners, without putting them down, and with really listening to their concerns and their ideas. I think based on my experience, what has really been essential for me to begin to work outside of academia is networks, and being involved in research networks that really go beyond academic research and really include a lot of people who are either in the practice side or the policy side. And that's important because as an academic, if you haven't learned this already, you'll learn it, that you really feel outside when you try to go to some events, and you just like, people look at you funny, like, who's that? And you don't feel like you have any commonality with most of the people there, even though you want to talk with them, but why should they talk to you? They don't know who you are. You're not in their group. And this is something that takes several years to begin to change, and you have to kind of prove yourself. You have to prove that you're not there to disrupt what they do. You're there to contribute and to learn, and you have to provide them with some motivation to include you, which can be very challenging. As many of you know, I was one of the main beginners of this international research network that is called Partners, which stands for People and Reforestation in the Tropics. And it's a network for synthesis for both education and research. And what we have done is try to pull together people who are interested in reforestation, but in understanding the drivers, the socio and environmental drivers of reforestation in tropics. So we've been pulling together lots of reviews, developing frameworks. We have some educational modules. Policy outreach has also been an important part of what we're doing, and linking researchers with practitioners and with different organizations around the world. So through this network, I've been able to have contact and meet people from lots of different perspectives, including other researchers. And from the beginning, we included a lot of organizations within partners, and people sent representatives to our workshops from all of these groups. And it has been a fantastic way to meet these people and to discuss your common ground. Many of them have become involved in the publications that we've done. So this has been a really fantastic way to build in the associations. And this was our group photo from our very first workshop in 2014. Hopefully some of you are attending this workshop, this webinar, who were at that workshop. It was really electric. We all became very energized and developed a whole set of new relationships through this. And we developed 5 different working groups, as you see here, numbered on the bottom, to explore different aspects of the social and environmental drivers of reforestation. And some of those groups are actually still actively working together. And then we had a second workshop about 1.5 years later, and this was in the fall, beautiful time in Connecticut. And this was more on how do we make restoration happen. So we designed the working groups to really focus on more practical issues, like spatial prioritization, economic incentives, value chains, governance frameworks, these sorts of really practical issues. And some of this work is also just reaching its synthesis now. And then this really brought a lot of people together who normally don't work with an academic community. And then during the interim, we also have had some funding from the SSYNC, the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Annapolis, Maryland, to work on the social dimensions of reforestation pathways. And that group, this was our first group here. This was together with the IFRI Flare Network and Arun Agrawal, who's pictured, and several people that he invited. And it really provided an opportunity to delve into more detail on the social side of things, including people who came in from outside and from international NGOs. From these various connections that we made, there have been a couple of international conferences and workshops that came out of it. The first one was in 2014 and really was a direct outcome of the first partners meeting, where we had Chetan Kumar from IUCN and Lars Estadius from World Resources Institute, and Bernardo Strasberg from the International Institute for Sustainability. And we all worked together to plan this workshop in Rio de Janeiro at the Botanical Garden. And out of this workshop came many other things, including this Rio call, where we all signed this agreement to elevate the role of natural regeneration. And we're actually starting to see the results of this in the media today, and in a lot of the social media and articles in The Guardian and articles in Nature. And this is starting to become a talked about issue, the importance of natural regeneration. Recently, I was able to coordinate this international workshop together with John Herbon, standing there in the front row. And we met at our first partners workshop as well, and now have a very close association. And now I work with the Center of the Tropical Forests and People Center that John directs at the University of the Sunshine Coast. So all those connections really came directly out of the Partners Network. Victoria Gutierrez, who's also standing in the first row, was a very important participant and has been working with a number of us on the Flores task force, which I'll mention in a little while. So this workshop was just held in Manila in the Philippines. And out of that, and we now have a Manila Declaration on forest and landscape restoration. And that is now posted on the website of the Global Partnership for Forest Landscape Restoration, which is all the major international groups that are working with restoration globally. So we're calling attention to the need to have some kind of frameworks for how we identify and conduct forest and landscape restoration, how we distinguish this from business as usual practices. There also have been some great opportunities, and once you can liberate yourself from the classroom and really get out there and not have to be coming back every few weeks to teach students in the classroom, there's a lot you can do. And it turned out that this initiative that is part of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, they have a Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, was interested in making a case for natural regeneration and asked me to coordinate writing this policy brief, which came out about a little bit over a year ago and is now translated into French and Spanish. And actually, I was contacted by an editor of Asia Global Online to write an article for them, for the Asia community, emphasizing natural regeneration. And that should be coming out pretty soon in their online magazine. So things sometimes cascade. Once you get yourself out there and you get this information out in the world, people begin to realize that's useful. I want that message to come across to my constituents. And also I was invited to participate in this project with Manuel Guariguata at C4 through some funding that he got through the USAID. And I did this also as a paid consultancy, and it was a great experience because I wanted to learn more about all these tools and had known a lot, but really wanted to learn more. And this was a great opportunity to sort of advance on my own synthesis while also producing a useful document for the community. So I think what I've been learning is that through consulting, you can advance your own agenda as well, not just doing work for someone else, but you can choose to do work or try to generate work that is also going to advance your own interests. Finally, I was employed for 2 years with the World Resources Institute and their Washington, D.C. office as a senior fellow, and was able to work with a number of groups there. This was a group generated by people in the economics world at WRI who were interested in evaluating sort of our state of knowledge about the economics and finance of restoring land. So this is a free document available online, and I was able to contribute to this work. And also during my tenure at WRI, I was able to participate in a field course that was held in Costa Rica with people from several different Latin American countries, Mexico, Nicaragua, Peru, I think Ecuador. And these are all professionals working in the restoration agenda. They're not academics. They're all mostly have master's degrees or are working as professionals. And they learned all about forest landscape restoration over this 2-week period. And we went out in the field as well and took them to Guanacaste. And we were able to show them a secondary forest in the area where Jennifer Powers in Horizontes, where she has her project, and visited there with Roger Villalobos from CATIE, and they got to see for themselves the forest regenerating there. And also I tried to push with the 20 by 20 initiative to bring them closer to biodiversity problems, and was able to introduce them to the team at CONABIO that is working with mapping and priority areas for restoration and conservation in Mexico. So we had a nice day there and went out to lunch with several of the people from CONABIO. And this was really great for me because I was really trying to bring in some expertise that they didn't have there and connect them with people who are actively working on this from more of a scientific perspective. Sitting right next to me is Renee Zamora, who's very active in the 20 by 20 team. Another way to really get connected outside of academia is to serve or volunteer to serve on boards and advisory groups for NGOs. I was contacted by Ecologic Development Fund to serve on the board of directors about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's been a great experience. I've been able to go out in the field with them in Honduras and meet their field team there. They also have a field team in Guatemala. They work directly with community organizations. They were needing information on agroforestry and on reforestation. And so they would sometimes field me questions. I would give them some information or point them in a direction. And they were really grateful to be able to count on expertise. And I've also been on the science board for the We Forest NGO, which is very heavily involved in reforestation and tree planting and natural regeneration activities in several sites around the world. And as you can see, they have a very strong science program, including a lot of the groups that I work with IPE in Brazil and Lastrope in Brazil at the University of Sao Paulo. And also with the Pacto, the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact. So some of us are working with each other, but also with We Forest, and it's become a really nice group. So something that came out of that is this Flores Task Force, and that stands for Forest Landscape Restoration Standards Task Force. And this actually, the discussions about this started between Victoria Gutierrez from We Forest, Pedro Brancaleon from Lastrope in Brazil, and me, and also developing a project with IPE in Brazil to understand criteria for the development of forest landscape restoration, and for both environmental criteria and social criteria. And how do people who are running projects, such as NGOs or community groups, how do they know it's going well? How do they know that they're covering all the bases? And can we provide them with some kind of framework, like a criteria and indicator framework that would really help them to keep on track and mark their own progress and make sure that they were actually implementing forest landscape restoration. So this group has had 3 workshops. This was our second workshop in Nairobi, Kenya, which we held immediately after the Global Landscape Forum, and we had a lot of participation from Africans in that group. And this was our recent workshop in the Philippines just before that international conference. And we also had, this one was of course dominated by people who work in the Philippines and Asia Pacific. So that was a really fantastic workshop as well. And I'd like to also address the issue of communication, which as academics, we learn that the most important thing is to write up your research and publish it. And if you don't do that, you might, well, people will say, if you didn't publish it, it wasn't even worth doing it, which I'm not sure I agree with. But nevertheless, this is how we measure our productivity in our own field. But when you get outside of academia, you realize that most people in the policy and practice world do not read the literature. Many of them don't have access, except for a few open access journals. But even if they do have access, they don't have time or inclination to read a detailed paper that's full of jargon and full of terms they don't know. And it doesn't spell out why is that important for them. So there's a huge need for communicating a lot of the research findings and the relevance of the research to this broader community. And without that effort, we're only going to be preaching to ourselves, talking to our students, our colleagues, and we are making advances on the science front, but that's not going to have any impact in the policy world or in the practice world. Last year, in beginning of May, we held a communications workshop within partners, and we invited people, including Jeff Sayer and Agni Boydatarno, and several other people who live there in Washington, D.C. as well, to come in. Francis Seymour is pictured there, and someone from IUCN as well, Ariana. And we had, we learned from them about communicating and how to pick issues and how to sort of pick your audience and how to connect with particular recipients of information. And the way you would communicate, for example, about a policy issue would be very different than the way you would communicate to practitioners, or you want to teach them a new technique or the importance or relevance of a new approach. So it's very important to target the message to particular audiences and to be effective at communicating that by using the right terminology, the right language, and in very short text. People tend to like infographics, they like pictures, they will grasp something from a picture much more readily than from reading 2 pages of text. A lot of people really don't like to read or take the time to read. And that makes communication challenging from the way we've been taught to communicate. And here it becomes very important to put this information out in packets and in ways that reach the broader audience. And one important way to do that is through blogs and social media. So this is our partners blog site, and it really is, at this point, the only active thing we have going on our partners website, although that's going to be changing in the future. But each of these blogs we have a large number of them are written based on research papers that have come out or issues or events that happened, and explaining to a broader audience why that's important. And so the social media aspect is also really important. So each of these blogs, once they're written, we can easily click and put it up on Facebook or put it up on Twitter. And this is our Facebook page. If you don't know it already, you have to ask to be admitted, but we admit almost anyone who wants to. We now have 372 members all around the world, and that being a member simply means that you can make a contribution to the website. So it's a public group on Facebook. And this has been fantastic. We have people linked in here from a number of different restoration groups, Ecologic, Foru in Thailand, groups all over the world, ECRAF. So you reach people from outside of academia, and you also reach the academics who are participating. And you learn a lot. I learn a lot every day from the postings. And we have a pretty big Twitter following. Now 100 people are following our Twitter feed, which is pretty active. So from this, people have learned about partners who didn't know about partners before, just by seeing our links. And that we're reaching people in a way that we couldn't do unless we participated in these activities. And then there's also blogs that are put up by other entities, like this is C4 News. They have a very good communications program online and put out news things every week, both in English and in Spanish. This one was the direct translation of the previous one in English, based on the special issue in Biotropica on natural regeneration and large-scale restoration. And that came out of that workshop in Rio de Janeiro. So encouraging all of you to think about this. When you write a paper, you're so like, okay, I'm done, it's published. No, you're not done. You've just begun. You've got to think about, before that paper comes out, get a press release from your university. Get help if you need it. Involve your co-authors in writing this up and get help to make it language that the public can understand. But write a blog about it, and including the conversation, which is specifically for academics to publish about their papers. Put links on Twitter and Facebook for your paper and for the blogs that come up on it, or any kind of media coverage that comes out of it. Write editorials for newspapers that really think about using the media and make a media plan for that paper. Who should benefit from this information? Who do you want to target it to? And I encourage you to take this seriously. We have gotten back to every single person who's contributed a paper for partners. We have over 35 papers. We're going to make a huge website that tries to convey all of this information in a carefully thought out way, with main messages and grouping themes together, and having links to all of the papers and to papers that they're linked to, and getting the abstract and one-page summaries that people can understand, like mini blogs for each of the papers. So we've contacted a lot of our people, and many of them said, oh, I'm too busy, why would I want to spend my time doing that? So there's still a reluctance to see the importance of this. And I think because you're participating in the webinar, you're already interested in this topic. So I may be preaching to the converted, but really take this seriously, because this is how we reach out and provide information. We can't complain about information not being used if we don't make an effort to put it out there. And to do that, you also need to get out, really put yourself out there in some of these global events. I was fortunate to be invited to this Global Landscape Forum, which was in Paris in 2015, a very exciting time. This was the Paris Agreement year. So this was an event held over the weekend that took advantage of all of the ministers and government officials who came to the IPCC, to the events there, and then they could participate in this forum. And I was able to give a plenary address there and bring out the issue of the importance of biodiversity in forest restoration. And I was the only talk at the whole meeting that had any content about ecology, really. But people listened, and they wouldn't have heard any of that if I had said, oh, I don't really want to go to that. I'm not talking to ecologists, why would I want to go? But it's all of the major organizations that work with environmental issues were there. And I went again this last time, last August, to their events in Nairobi. And I wasn't invited to give anything, but I submitted a talk for one of our brief landscape talk, which is the only venue there that allows individuals to contribute. And those were, I was selected to give a talk. Not everybody is, so I was really lucky. 7 minutes is all you get. So you have to really package things in a very easy to understand and pleasant way for the audience. And it's hard work to put something like that together. It's as hard as putting a 1 hour talk together. But it was a great opportunity. So I'm just going to kind of end this with 5 lessons that I've learned in terms of how to proceed and my own experience. One thing that I've learned is that every organization has their own agenda. So if you want to become involved in working with an organization, you need to learn about what they do and how they think and their culture. And one thing that surprised me, even though I was warned about this, is that scientists are often distrusted or disregarded. And scientists have a reputation of being very dogmatic, narrow-minded, and very impractical. And some of them really are. So this is not a baseless assumption. But of course, we aren't. And you want people to treat you as an individual. And that can be really hard if there's a stereotype out there and people just disregard you if you're from academia. And I almost felt like I had to leave academia to really become embraced by some of these organizations. So if you want to work within an organization, you have to point out how that's beneficial to them and how it's going to further their agenda or their fundraising or their ability to attract funding to have you on board. And that's up to you to make that case. A lot of organizations will try to get things from you as an academic. You may have experienced this. Can you send me this and that, or can you give us some advice on this and that? And they would just as well not have to hire a consultant to work to do something for them if they can get that from free. And I think they will. That many academics are happy to provide that information for free, which is fine. But I think it feeds into this sense that organizations don't need to hire experts and they don't need to pay consultants. Most organizations who work with restoration that I know don't have experts on staff, at least experts on restoration. They have experts on economics or on policy issues, and they don't really know anything about what happens on the ground. And they also have a very different standard for what they call evidence and research than people coming from an academic background. So when they talk about an evidence base, they basically mean some success stories that they can pull out of on the internet or of the literature that show that something good can come from a certain kind of intervention. They're happy with that because they want to push that intervention, so they hold up those examples and they've done their research on it, and what could go wrong? So that's their understanding of evidence, and it's taken me some time to realize that, and to realize too with WRI, the World Resources Institute, that they really didn't know what to do with me. and when they ran out of money after 2 years, I'm still on paper a senior fellow, but I'm not employed by them anymore. And there may be some opportunity in the future, but right now they don't have any money for me, and they're doing just fine without me. So in a way, they kind of realized, they didn't really need to have a scientist on board, but they like to kind of show my name to give them some credibility. So that can be a little bit annoying, but sometimes it's a little bit of give and take, and maybe a better opportunity will come along to work with them and where they really will use my scientific expertise. But our own academic institutions also have agendas, and so that's something to be really mindful of. They may see your activity moving out and as violating some issues and some principles that they have. So it's important that they don't see your activity as being an advocate, that they see your activity as being either a scientific consultant or a scientific advisor, and you are basically providing a service based on your expertise as a scientist. You are not out there campaigning, for a particular type of restoration practice and to the exclusion of the scientific evidence for that. So it's important that you keep the focus on how science and scientific research can enable the improvement of both policies and practice. Lesson number 2, don't be alone. We can't do these things alone. So you have to seek out people to work with. And those people, like you, want to move out of the strict academic circle and want to have an impact outside of that. And that's one way Partners has been really helpful. It's helped to connect me with people who work with the state of Sao Paulo in their environmental division, with people who work with C4, with people who work with WeForest, people who work with restoration in the Philippines, people who work with the Pacto in Brazil, people who work with Nature Conservancy in Brazil. And when we have a common bond that we share, and we can all work together, and that's important. Finding those groups is really important, and also finding the organizations to work with. So, example, WeForest has turned out just to be a really open organization. Here, their website says science-based solutions for companies to engage in restoration. they put it out there that they're interested in science-based solutions. So they have their science board, and Victoria Gutierrez, who's their coordinator, has used the Partners Connections really to fill a lot of slots on that board and to work with them as well. So that's been important. The fourth lesson is to really push yourself, to go outside of your comfort zone. This means that you come into contact with people who you know represented things you didn't like, or have views that you don't particularly like, or that really kind of reject you as a scientist. But being perseverant and showing examples of how this information can be important, can be transformative. It might not work the first time. It might not work the second time, but eventually other people start to adopt it, and then they start hearing it from 3 or 4 people, and then they like, oh yeah, you're right after all. So this is where you need to be bold, and you need to put yourself out there and push yourself a little bit. It doesn't mean you have to be obnoxious. It doesn't mean you have to be pushy. It means you need to just keep asking for a seat at that table. And sometimes that means you have to bring your own chair. And that happened to me with the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration, where I kept trying to get partners to be included as one of their members. And basically they said no, but they still said, well, you can come, Robin, to our meeting. And I did. And, I haven't come to any meetings after that, but they kind of made an effort initially. But now they're recognizing that some of the work that we've been doing is important. And for example, they're putting up that Manila Declaration on their website because Victoria Gutierrez, WeForest is in there, SER is in there, and they were all involved, the Society for Ecological Restoration. So together with the partners and the group that we formed, there's enough sort of critical mass that influenced the global partnership. So these things, these partnerships that you have and the collaborations can really help to get you a seat at that table. And finally, from your perspective as a scientist, and from your perspective as you get out there and sort of see what's happening out there, you begin to see gaps, you begin to see several different organizations that are kind of working toward the same thing, but they're not working together. You have a perspective that they don't have. And you have a way of putting this little piece in the puzzle for them or for a larger group of people that makes you an important person. It means you have to push yourself out there. You have to be a leader, and you have to show that you have that missing piece that can be really useful in completing this arc of communication, or completing the work that you need to show that policies have certain outcomes. And a lot of this is because you have a perspective as an outsider, and you can see these gaps and you can see these synergies that they can't see from the inside, or that they can't influence from their inside position. And as an outsider, you may be able to help push things in a way that an insider can't. And so I think that's been valuable. I'm beginning to learn how to start acting in this way. And it does mean you have to really be bold and be pretty sure that you know what you're doing. So this is my big push that I'm working on now, which is to start a new company that's working at this interface between the scientific knowledge and the practice of restoration. And one of the things that we want to do, in addition to taking contracts to help organizations make those links better, is to create this global bank of case studies on forest and landscape restoration, and also to map those on an atlas so that we have a really robust and independent set of information about what's been tried, what were the outcomes, what interventions they had, et cetera. Who was involved in this? How did they finance it? All of this information and case studies that would be a global resource for anybody working in the field. So this is my new activity, and it's going to be called For Restoration Partners, and it's going to be set up as a company, not as a nonprofit. So we will work based on contracts and grants that will be through our partner organization, which will be LT, the Environmental Leadership Training Institute, that works out of Yale. And this kind of came out of another workshop we had through partners about what do we do now? How do we continue this work? And how do we deal with this huge gap out there? And it was only from our own research, our own work, getting out there and seeing the landscape of activity that we could see, like, there's no organization really doing this in a good way with scientific expertise. We've built up all of this expertise with our network, and we can start applying that to helping organizations to make these critical connections on the ground. So that was all I have for the presentation. I think I've used up about all my time. I'm going to throw out a few ideas for discussion. First of all, tell us about your own experiences that you've had bridging academic research and conservation or restoration in the practice and policy world. What kind of barriers have you encountered? And particularly, I want to hear from the young scientists about how they can do this, if it's possible. It's much easier to think about a senior person in the field kind of retiring from teaching and being able to take on this kind of work, but much harder to imagine doing that as you're a young scientist. And how can we combine academic responsibilities for teaching and grant writing and training students with some of these non-academic? There are some great synergies that can be accomplished, but I'd love to talk about some examples. And finally, how can ATBC help, and how can the Neotropical chapter help in particular to try to make connections, to try to have discussions about this, to help each other to achieve this goal of working outside of academia and getting a seat around the table. So thank you very much, and I hope we have a fruitful discussion.
Great, thank you, Robin.
Oh, great, Robin. Very inspiring talk.
I'm still recording.
That's okay, but we can cut. But
we can cut it later.
It was kind of fun. When I first started putting it together, I thought, God, I don't have anything. And then I realized I had a lot.
You have a lot to say. Great.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Well, I hope it recorded well on the cloud. We will check it out later when it will be uploaded.
I guess if